Hey, welcome back to the channel. I'm Michael Green, and today we're going to be talking about the differences between living in Tampa versus St. Petersburg. So let's get right into it. One of the very unique things about the Tampa Bay area is that you have two different regions, really. So you have Tampa in Hillsborough County in the more inland section, and then you have that peninsula that comes down, which is Pinellas County, and that's where St. Petersburg is. And even though these two areas are very close to each other, they're also very different from one another. And so as we talk about some of the differences we're going to talk about today between St. Petersburg and Tampa, a lot of the things that we're going to talk about really come down to the geography and how the different areas developed. So underlying within a lot of these things we'll talk about, we'll keep coming back to how they're geographically different, but also because of them being geographically different and just historically how things have played out, how the cities themselves have developed and now created these differing characteristics between the two of them. So that brings us to the first thing, and potentially the most obvious thing, and that is that you have two different downtown areas. So you have downtown Tampa, and then you have downtown St. Pete. And one is not a suburb of the other. They're both individual downtown urban areas, even though they're pretty much just right over the bridge from one another. You'll typically find that people do have a preference between downtown Tampa and downtown St. Pete, because while they do have a lot of similar characteristics, the overall feel between the two downtowns is very, very different. So the first really big difference between the two is the overall building structure, and a lot of that's due to how these different cities developed. So Tampa overall feels more industrial and like a traditional city, where when you're down there, a lot of the bigger buildings are office building, industrial buildings, and you have convention centers, things like that, all of the things that you typically expect to find in a downtown area. St. Pete is a very different downtown, where a lot of the larger buildings, you do have some office buildings, but the majority of your larger buildings are actually residential housing. And so traditionally and historically, you've had a lot of people that have moved to St. Pete to be closer to the beaches. They've moved over here to retire, and that's continued to be the case over time. And so because of that, the downtown is smaller, but also it is more residential focused. So a lot of your big buildings are arguably more attractive looking buildings because they are meant to be residential and look fancy. That's up for debate, but there definitely is a difference between the actual structure of how the downtowns look and feel, because one is more industrial in a typical downtown, whereas one is more residential focused. And with that difference, you'll also find that St. Pete is generally more walkable too. So whether you actually live downtown in St. Pete or you're just coming downtown for the day from wherever you are, you'll find that you really can walk wherever you want to go. And on top of that, you also have the Sunrunner, which takes you around to the beaches and up and down Central Avenue, where a lot of the restaurants and bars and boutique shops are. And you really could go around all around St. Petersburg for the day or living there and not have to have a car. So you'll typically find St. Petersburg is more walkable overall, whereas Tampa is more spread out. And a lot of that is just because of what I had said before, where you have more industrial buildings, you have a lot of office buildings, and there are some localized, really cool areas with stuff to do. But if you were going to want to get from one area to the other, you're going to have to walk kind of far in between the two and around office buildings and things like that. Now, you do have some transit systems that they're putting in. You have the trolley that goes around downtown, and that makes it a little bit more accessible by foot. But in general, it's definitely a less walkable downtown than St. Petersburg. But overall, there is a lot to do in both places, but they have a very different feel. So you'll want to experience both to kind of determine which one you prefer. So over in St. Pete, you have the pier and then all the parks that go along the water. Whereas over in downtown Tampa, you have Bayshore Boulevard and you have the Riverwalk that goes all along the water over there. Over in Tampa, for nightlife and bars and some of the things to do on the weekends, you have Hyde Park and Ybor and some of the things along the Riverwalk. Whereas over in St. Pete, you have the places that go up and down Central Avenue and along Beach Drive. And then of course, for sports games, they both have that too, where over in downtown Tampa, you have the Tampa Bay Lightning, and in downtown St. Pete, you have the Tampa Bay Rays and the Tampa Bay Rowdies. So ultimately, there are a lot of things that seem similar at face value, but the overall feel and experience of each is different. So you're gonna wanna experience that for yourself as you kind of get a feel for which downtown you prefer more. And that brings us to the second big difference between Tampa and St. Petersburg, which is the availability of suburbs and more suburban areas versus more urban core kind of areas. And opinions will differ on this depending on where you might be from and what you consider to be more suburban versus urban core areas. But overall, you'll find that over on the Tampa side, you're gonna have a lot more suburban areas that surround the more urban core areas that are nearer to the downtown. Whereas over in St. Petersburg, most of the housing in the entire area is going to be more urban core kind of housing. And this largely goes back to what we were talking about before, where you have different geography and the areas have developed in different ways. So when you're looking over at Tampa, since Tampa is more central and then you have areas that expand out from every other direction, you have more of a traditional development of a metropolitan area. So typically you'll see that you have city centers and then you'll see housing expand from the city center, and you have more urban areas where it's more dense around the cities. And then as you go further out from that, you'll start to see the suburbs. And since Tampa resembles that more closely than St. Pete, you do typically see, or just in general, there's more suburbs that are right there around Tampa. So distinguished master plan communities that maybe have amenities, you've got larger lots, there's specific community features. You'll have maybe homeowners associations and things like that that are out in those more suburban areas. Whereas over on the St. Petersburg side, since you're on that peninsula and you don't have a whole bunch of land to expand outwards like you do in most cities, most of the housing that you'll find in the entire Pinellas County, well, more closer to the St. Petersburg area, is going to be more urban core kind of housing, where it's generally more dense. It's not as, established HOA communities like you'll typically maybe be used to if you're from Texas or areas that have more of those suburban communities. It's going to be more urban, more dense, more city-like. And with that said, you do have some really nice communities where some homes have larger lots and they have a lot of character to the community, but it definitely in most cases isn't going to be described as more of like a suburban community kind of feel over in St. Petersburg. And so those differences really translate into different lifestyles between the two. If you're looking for a more suburban neighborhood, that's just not something that you're really going to find in most cases over on the St. Pete side. And so that's one big thing that you're going to want to consider when you're considering whether you're going to go over to Tampa or over to St. Pete. And something that relates to this is the next big difference between Tampa and St. Petersburg, and that is the traffic that you will deal with between St. Petersburg and Tampa. So similar to what we were talking about the development of cities, you are generally going to deal with more traffic over in Tampa than St. Petersburg. And I will say, regardless of who you talk to and where they're from in the Tampa Bay area, you are going to hear a lot of complaining about the amount of traffic, especially over the last few years, because as we've had so much of an influx of people, you've just seen a much higher level of traffic come into the area overall. But even with that said, you still are going to see a lot more traffic over in the Tampa area, and that is for a similar reason, and that is that you have housing and development all around downtown Tampa and you just have a larger population over there. So you have more people that are commuting to and from downtown and to other areas like over to Orlando and Lakeland than you do over in St. Pete. And so because of that, you have more highways, you have more interstates, and you have more people that are using them all to get to and from downtown and across the map in different directions. And so because of that, you just have, especially during rush hour, you have astronomical traffic all over Tampa, but especially closer to the downtown areas over in Tampa. Now, on the St. Pete side, you still are gonna have a good amount of traffic. You have a lot more traffic than you did a number of years ago, but the traffic patterns are different than you'll find in Tampa. So you'll find really on the east side of the peninsula, that's where you have the interstate that comes down. It goes pretty much right next to downtown and then goes down over to the beach and then south to over the bay to the Skyway Bridge. You generally are going to find a lot less traffic on the interstate over in St. Pete, and unless you go up over to US 19 to get up closer to Clearwater, there's just generally less congestion throughout the day. Now, over time, that might change a little bit, but we are at a point where over in Tampa, you'll run into traffic just all throughout the day, whereas in St. Pete, you don't deal with as much traffic. So again, people will say, oh, there's so much traffic in downtown St. Pete now, but in my opinion, it's not really that bad. And one thing that they did when they developed the interstates that was really smart in St. Petersburg is they built two prongs of the interstate that come off of 275 and they turn into 175 and 375, and they have exits on both sides of the downtown. And so this allows people to get on and off the interstate from both sides of downtown, which alleviates a lot of the traffic that you would have in St. Petersburg. And then on top of that, all of St. Petersburg follows the grid system. So whether you're trying to get east or west in St. Pete, or you're needing to go north or south, you don't have to take the interstate or have to take a certain road. There's a number of different routes that you can take to get to where you're going. And because of that, it alleviates traffic on any specific route, and you generally aren't going to deal with as much traffic over in the St. Pete area. So the next big difference between Tampa and St. Petersburg we'll talk about is the difference in lifestyle options that you have between the two areas. And some of these things are things that we've covered already, like the ability to live in a more suburban area versus urban core, the amount of traffic that you're going to deal with on a daily basis, your access to different downtowns and the activities that they offer. But also, one of the big things is the proximity to the beach and to the water. And really, there is a huge difference between living over in St. Petersburg and Pinellas County and living over in Tampa. And that really is something that a lot of people don't consider when they're moving to Tampa Bay. They pretty much look at the map and they think, Tampa Bay, there's water all over the place, and I'm going to be able to live up in a suburb of Tampa and get over to the beach. It's not going to be that big of a deal. We'll go all the time. But they come to find out that because it's so far and because there's so much traffic that they deal with, that they don't ever end up going to the beach or using their boat or even getting a boat if that's something that they wanted to do. Whereas if you're over in St. Petersburg, you're very close to the beach and you're very close to the water. And so if you want to be able to integrate, the beach water lifestyle, you're much more likely, and it's going to be much easier to do that if you're over in St. Petersburg and Pinellas County on that peninsula versus over in Tampa. Because over in Tampa, you can get to the bay and you can launch your boat into the bay. But even if you live on the water there, if you want to get out to the Gulf, you got to go all the way through the Gulf to actually get through the bay and out there. And so in general, you're going to have a lot more accessibility to the beach and to the water if you're over in St. Petersburg as opposed to over in Tampa. So one of the other really big differences in terms of lifestyle options is your availability of shopping centers and your big box shopping and restaurants and franchises, things like that. Because Tampa has developed a lot more like a traditional American city and you have more people and more different distinguished areas, you'll find that all of those different areas have their own hubs of shopping centers and franchises and restaurants and things like that all over the place. So regardless of where you live, chances are that there's going to be a major intersection with a lot of shopping and restaurants that's pretty close by you. Whereas over in St. Petersburg, it's not developed like that as much. You pretty much will have these areas around the city that have a lot of shopping and franchises that are over in those areas, whereas closer to downtown, it's going to be more boutique and independent restaurants. But the things like your Target and Walmart and big box stores and franchise restaurants like a Chili's or something like that, they're pretty much condensed into a few areas instead of being all over the place and spread out like you might find in Tampa. And so because of that, you might have a further drive and it might take you longer to get there than it would if you live over in Tampa. So if you want to live in more of, like a suburban area where you just drive a few minutes and you're right at all the shopping that you need to get to, it might be harder to find that kind of thing in St. Petersburg unless you live near one of those kind of hubs of shopping relative to what you might find in many of the different areas of Tampa. And the last really big lifestyle difference that I would say between Tampa and St. Petersburg is the overall level of walkability and how your proximity to parks from where you live relative to Tampa and St. Pete. So this does depend on where you're living, but in general over in Tampa, I would say if you're in one of the more urban core areas, you're gonna be still just not in a super walkable area. You're not gonna be able to walk to a lot of things that you may wanna get to. You probably aren't gonna be able to walk to a park or something like that. Unless you live in one of the more suburban areas where your neighborhood maybe has a park and you can walk around your neighborhood. On the other side of that, we talked about the walkability of downtown St. Pete, but even if you're not in downtown St. Pete, most of St. Petersburg, in the residential areas, do have parks that are really nearby. So you do have a higher level of walkability in St. Petersburg to different things, but especially to parks and things like that. And so depending on where you're living, that may or may not be a huge consideration for you, but it is definitely a noticeable lifestyle difference in options between Tampa and St. Petersburg. And so that brings us to the last big difference between Tampa and St. Petersburg, and that is the weather between the two different places. And this is an interesting one because a lot of people wouldn't think that there's going to be a significant difference between the weather because, you're looking at the map and it's all Tampa Bay. You'd think the weather is going to be pretty similar, but that's not really the case. St. Petersburg is the infamous, sunshine city, but that really is true. You do get a lot more sunshine overall in St. Petersburg than you do in Tampa. Now, with that said, you do get a lot of sun in Tampa all year round. There's going to be a comparable number of sunny days between the two, but the feel of the weather is very different. So when you're over in Tampa, especially during the summertime, you're going to see that it is raining a lot more. You're going to get a lot more storms that come through and kind of linger, and it's more cloudy. And in a lot of cases, it's going to feel more humid over there. And especially if you live further out in more of the suburban inland areas that are farther from downtown and farther from the bay, you'll find that you'll have storms that come around, 2 or 3 o'clock, and they pretty much just stay for a few hours, and it just rains like for a good portion of every day during the summer. Whereas over in St. Pete, what you'll find is that even when it's raining over in Tampa, like you can see the clouds over there, it's still pretty sunny. And on top of it being sunny, you'll find that it also is generally breezy all year round. So not only during the winter, but even during the summer when it's hot. Whereas in Tampa, where it's really hot and humid and the air feels very muggy and it's just kind of sitting there. Over in St. Pete, again, going back to the geography, because it's a peninsula and you have the water all around it, but you also have the sea breeze that's coming off of the Gulf, you have air and breeze that comes all the time. And so generally speaking, I would say that you're gonna have better weather in St. Petersburg all year round. Whereas over in Tampa, it is going to be a little bit more muggy. You're going to get more rain. It's not going to be as sunny all the time. And I say this as someone that's lived in both places. I would say that you definitely are going to have noticeably better weather in St. Petersburg. So that pretty much concludes what I would say are the biggest differences to consider when you're thinking about Tampa versus St. Petersburg. Of course, if you have any questions or comments about any of these things or additional things, you can leave those down in the comment section below. Or of course, feel free to reach out to me. I'm available to answer any questions that you may have. And if this video was valuable to you, feel free to subscribe. I'll be releasing new videos about Tampa Bay every single week. So I hope you enjoyed this video and stay tuned.